Hello again. As you know, I am Eli the Computer Guy. Today's class is Introduction to Servers. So most people, when they first start learning about servers, they normally go through some kind of certification track or they take a class that is very specific on servers. Like I started out with the MCSE, the Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer track. So when I learned servers, all I really learned was Microsoft servers. They talked about Mac servers, like a little bit. They talked almost nothing about Linux. They put Novell in there because they had to. But they didn't teach us about servers in general. They taught us very specifically about Windows servers and Windows servers only. Well, as we are going into this server track, I want to give you a broader foundation on understanding how servers work. So in this class today, we are going to talk about a couple specific products, but we're going to talk more about the general idea of servers, what servers do in the network, what they provide to the clients on the network, and things that you need to think about if you're thinking about installing or if you have to maintain a server. So today's class on Introduction to Servers, again, this is not specific. We're going to talk a little bit about Windows servers, a little bit about Linux servers. We're going to mention that there's Mac servers out there, but we're not going to focus on those. This class is going to just be the overall idea of what is a server, why is it useful, and what do you do with it if you have one. So give me a couple minutes. I'll be back and we'll get into this class. Now, the first thing that we have to do when we're talking about servers is we have to define what a server is. So a server is not simply, if it has server in the name, Windows 2008 server. That is a server, but that's not the only thing that can be a server. Basically, all a server is, this is nothing to be nervous about, all a server is it's a computer on a network that provides services to other computers on the network. So a file server is a computer on the network that has files in it that other people can get to. A print server on the network is a computer with a printer attached that can share out that printer to other computers on the network. So somebody can press print on one computer and it will print out on another computer. A web server is simply a computer with special software installed on it that allows that computer to present websites to people going to that computer. So all a server is a computer on the network that provides services to other computers. Now, this might be Windows 2008 server, Windows 2003 server, Ubuntu server, Red Hat Linux Enterprise Server Edition. It can be that. Or it can also be a Windows XP Home Edition computer that simply has a shared folder that everybody can access and grab files. So one of the big things that I want to get through your head is that all a server is a computer on the network that provides services to other computers on the network. Many people waste a lot of their own money and a lot of other people's money because when they go, oh, I need a file server, let's say they have a little office and they have 5 people in that office and they go, oh, I need a file server. Well, they run out and they spend $4,000 on an enterprise class Windows 2008 server. And they can now share out the files to everybody in the office. And they go, wow, bonus, I now have a file server. Well, they did not need a full Windows 2008 server in order to share out a few files on the network. They could have used, like I say, Windows XP Home Edition to share out files on the network, and it would have been a lot less expensive. So the main thing when we define server is that to be a server, the computer doesn't have to have server in the name of the operating system. All the computer does to have to be a server is it has to provide services to other computers on the network. So now that we've defined what a server is, so a server is a computer on the network that provides services to clients on the network. We have to kind of differentiate between servers and servers. What do I mean by that? Well, in the real world, you basically have two different types of servers. You have the little file server sitting in an office with 5 people that people either back up files to or they get something off of every once in a while. It is a server, it is useful, people share information, but if the server crashes or something goes a little hinky, nobody's really going to lose their mind over it. Nobody's going to get fired over it. Then you have servers. Servers, real servers, are computers that have to be on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and if they stop functioning ever, for any reason, everything just goes to absolute hell. Like with this company, everymanit.com. Our web servers, our media servers, have to be online 24 hours a day. They rarely even get rebooted. They get rebooted maybe once a month, more likely once every 2 or 3 months. These things have to be rock solid, stable. If anything happens, they have to be able to survive small problems. So if there's a small problem in the operating system or the hardware, they have to be able to survive that and keep going, because if something fails, well, then the entire business just goes away. So we've defined server as providing services for clients on the network. But then what you have to think about is you do have two very, very different types of servers. You have the server, like I say, that deals with 5 people in an office. It has a printer connected to it. It has some shared files. You know, again, if it dies, it's sad. You know, we shed a tear or whatever, but nobody's going to lose their job over it. Versus servers. These are the really cool things that everybody wants to work on. Servers, they have to be up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so when most people talk about servers, when you discuss servers with most people, these are the types of servers that they're going to be talking about. They're going to be talking about rock solid pieces of equipment that basically should never fail. So just keep that in mind. There are 2 different types of servers in the world, and we're going to go into that in these next 2 sections when we talk about server operating systems and then server hardware. So let's take a moment to talk about server operating systems. As we said before, the little Windows XP home computer can be a server. But the issue with that little XP home computer is it's not designed to be on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to never be rebooted, to never really need repairs. It's built to be a little computer you can either do some word processing or play video games on. Well, Microsoft and all the other companies out there, on top of creating desktop operating systems, they also create server operating systems. Server operating systems are more robust, more stable, and generally more secure than the desktop operating systems. So if you're thinking, why don't I use that Windows XP home computer, because that's going to be a lot less expensive than buying a full-fledged Windows 2008 server, it really depends on what you need that server for. If you need to share files to 5 or 10 people in an office, a little Windows XP computer would be fine for you. Windows 2008 servers, or any servers, whether they're Linux or Mac OS actually has a full server, they are made to be much more robust and to deal with many more incoming connections than the little home desktop computers. Imagine and realize that real server operating systems, like if you're dealing with Windows 2008 server and you're using it for what's called an Active Directory server, so people actually log into it and they gain resources to the network, one single Windows 2008 server can support up to 10,000 users. So that server software is much more robust and can deal with far more users and far more issues than the little desktop operating system will. So the reason people use the server operating systems versus the desktop operating systems is, again, they can scale up. They can deal with far more users than a desktop computer can. One of the things you have to realize when you're dealing with server operating systems is a lot of times they can seem much more complicated than desktop computers because they actually don't come with as many of the nice little friendly user tools that desktop computers come with. Since you're new with servers, something to think about is that every time you put a piece of software or put a piece of functionality onto a computer, into the operating system, not only do you get that extra functionality, but you also get possible extra flaws, bugs, and defects that hackers can use to compromise that system. So when you install Flash onto your computer, you like it because you can watch videos. You can watch this video because you have Flash installed. But that Flash actually has security holes that hackers can use to take over the computer. So when the vendors create server operating systems, they don't put in as many of those nice little features into the server operating systems because they want to make the server operating systems more secure. So if you're dealing with a Windows 2008 server, when you go into it, you're going to notice that it's much more difficult to get around and administer that server than it is a normal Windows desktop computer, because there's not as many nice, fancy, little flashy wizards and easy to do stuff. If you use Linux, like if you decide to use Ubuntu Linux as a server, you'll notice if you download and install the desktop version of Ubuntu Linux, you get a nice little graphical interface. You can go in, you can left click, you can right click, and you can do all the stuff that you think of when you use a computer. If you download the server software, after it reboots, you're going to be seeing something that looks like a DOS prompt. And there's just going to be a little cursor that's blinking at you. And it will only do whatever it is you type into it to tell it to do. So why they do that is because all those fancy little graphics that make the server easier to use also create security holes. So if you want a very secure Linux web server, you don't want all the graphical stuff. You don't want Firefox installed. You don't even want the GUI. You don't want cursors and buttons and all of that. You just want that little DOS prompt, so you can type in and tell it exactly what you want it to do, and that's all it will do. So when you're dealing with the server operating systems, although in many ways they can be much more sophisticated, or are much more sophisticated than the desktop computers, they're not necessarily as user-friendly. So you really have to understand what you're doing before you start going in there and start to mess with stuff. Because if you do something stupid, it can be much more difficult to get back to where you came from. The last part, when you're dealing with server software, so we've talked about the server operating systems. Server operating systems, when you go to buy software, let's say backup software or utility software, one thing to realize, to know, is that software is going to be much more expensive than the normal comparable desktop versions. So when I had the repair shop, we used Acronis for our backup solution, whether it was desktop computers or servers. Well, the Acronis for a desktop computer was anywhere between $50 to $100, depending on what edition we bought. The backup software for the servers that we installed, it seems like it's the exact same thing, but for whatever reason, that was $600 to $700. So this is something to realize when you're deciding between using a desktop operating system as a server or a server operating system as a server, is the software for that server operating system is going to be more expensive. Again, we used disk management, as partitioning software to enlarge or shrink partitions. On a desktop computer, it cost $50. For a server, it cost $600. Basically the same functionality. One was for a server, one was for a desktop computer. 10 times the cost. So we've kind of talked about the server operating systems. Remember, any computer that provides a service on the network is technically a server. But then you have two types of servers. The server, that supports 5 users, it's a little computer, has a couple files on it, has a printer, and the servers support up to 10,000 users at a time, are much more robust, are expected to never be rebooted, etc. When you're looking to install a server for yourself or your client, really think about what you need. Because again, like I say, the little Windows XP computer is fine for 5 people and is very inexpensive. The server, the Windows 2008 server, is very robust, but very expensive. Like I say, even the backup software was $600, just for one piece of software. So that's a brief introduction on what server operating systems are. Now let's go into, and we're going to talk about server hardware. So we just talked about server operating systems. So server operating systems, Windows 2008 Server, Ubuntu Server Edition, anything like that, those are operating systems that are built to be on servers that are going to be very robust, very tough, more secure, etc. Well, the same is true of server hardware. So you can use any hardware to create a server. You can go out to Best Buy and you can buy the crappiest little e-machine. You can throw it on the network and you can share out files, and you can use that fine as a file server or whatever type of server you need. You don't need specialized hardware for servers. But just like with the server operating systems, they do make special hardware for servers, and if you need your server to be up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, etc., you should really think about using real server hardware. The first piece of server hardware that you probably know is server processors. So in Intel, these are called Xeon processors. Basically, the reason you want to use a Xeon processor is that processor is built for dealing with the tasks that servers normally deal with. So if you want a really fast video game machine, right now you probably buy an Intel i7 quad-core processor, and that is built for video games. That will be very good for video games. Well, what you need in a server computer is not the same as what you need in a video game computer. So you would go out and you would buy a Xeon processor. These processors they're very good at just chugging through and just dealing with data and doing the stuff that servers do. So the first thing is the Xeon processor. Again, you don't need it, but it is better if you're using a server. The next thing when you're dealing with a server is something called redundant power supplies. So what the redundant power supplies are is within the normal form factor for a power supply, they can fit anywhere between 2 to 3 power supplies in there. And so if one of the power supplies fails, the other 2 are still active and the computer stays on. So imagine if dust gets blown in or just a capacitor blows out, any of the normal stuff. If one of those power supplies dies, the computer is still on. It's still functional. Most of these redundant power supplies are hot swappable. So you can actually, if one of those the redundant power supplies fails, you can pull it out, you can order a new one and just plug it in and go on your way. You do not have to reboot the system. That's hot swappable. Now again, almost all of these redundant power supplies allow you to hot swap the different power modules. And normally you can have anywhere between 2 to 3 modules. So you can have up to basically 2 power supplies fail. So that's what the redundant power supplies do, is they allow one power supply to fail, but the computer stays on. With the power supplies, in most servers, you will also hear of something called RAID. RAID is Redundant Array of Inexpensive Disks. We actually have a whole class on RAID. It's called Intro to RAID, if you want to take a look at it. Basically, what RAID does is it allows you to combine multiple physical disks into one logical disk. So most of the time, if you have a server, you will either have something called disk striping with parity or disk mirroring. Disk mirroring is where you have 2 hard drives in the machine that are identical. So one piece of data gets put on one piece of data gets put on the other. Another piece of data gets put on one, another piece of data gets put on the other. If one of these hard drives fails, the computer stays running because you have 2 identical hard drives. These hard drives are, again, what is called hot swappable. So if one hard drive fails, you pull out the drive that failed, you plug in a brand new hard drive. It does something, the computer does something called, it rebuilds the array, and then you go back to being redundant. So if one hard drive fails, the computer stays up, you pull out the bad hard drive, you put the new hard drive in, everything stays running. You never turn the computer off. This is all while the computer is still on. RAID 5 is where you can combine anywhere between 3 to 32 disks into one logical hard drive. And what happens is it stripes the data across all the hard drives that you have in that RAID, and then it has one hard drive that's used for parity. Basically, to make this easy, if you have 5 hard drives, it stripes the data along all of those hard drives and uses one of the hard drives. It's kind of like a recovery drive. So if any single hard drive in that RAID fails, you can pull that bad hard drive out. The computer still stays functional. You put the new hard drive in. It does something called rebuilding the array, and you just go on your life. The computer or the server never shuts down. So this is RAID. The last thing that you see in servers is it's called ECC RAM. This is error checking something RAM. What this is most RAM that you put into your computer, like into a normal desktop computer, and frankly what I put in my servers. ECC RAM is incredibly expensive, and I don't see the purpose, but we're going to tell you about it. What this does is when you normally boot up your computer, your computer normally boots up, and it just accepts the RAM that's in there for what it is, and you go on with your life. ECC RAM actually runs a check. It runs a self-test of that RAM to make sure that the RAM is functioning properly. And if it's not, it does a couple of corrections. This means that you don't have to worry about having any bad RAM, because bad RAM, if you're using a desktop computer, if you're just doing PowerPoint presentations in Word, it's probably never going to affect you. But remember, real servers that have 1,000, if you have a web server that has 1,000 visitors an hour, or if something that's really crunching a lot of information, if you have anything bad, really, it can start to cause massive consequences. A little snowball turns into a big boulder. So the error checking RAM makes sure that the RAM is perfect, and if it's not, it does some little corrections in there to make sure that it won't affect the server when it's online. Again, this is nice because it makes sure your RAM is perfect. It makes sure you don't have any small problems that snowball into bigger problems, but you're going to spend 3 to 4 times as much on your RAM when you decide to use it. ECC RAM, out of all this stuff, is a thing I am least worried about. None of my servers use it. Maybe when everymanit.com has thousands and thousands and thousands of people hitting it per hour, we'll worry about it. But this is something that realistically, unless you really need just a perfect system, you don't need ECC RAM. So we talked about the Xeon processors. These are basically just processors designed for servers, for server applications. We've talked about the redundant power supplies. So the redundant power supplies mean that if one of those power modules fails, the computer still stays on and running. You can replace the one module, put a new module in, and keep going. We talked about RAID. That's where you combine multiple physical disks into one logical disk. If any one of those hard drives fails, you can pull out the hard drive, put a new one in, and the computer does something called rebuilding the array, and it just basically fixes it. We have an entire class on RAID called Intro to RAID, if you want to learn more about RAID. And then finally, we talked about ECC RAM. Again, this is RAM that does a self-test of itself and it corrects problems if there are problems. Very, very good if you need the absolute most robust server in the world, but again, it's going to cost you a foolish amount of money. I don't use it, but it's kind of your decision on that ECC RAM. So now that we've talked about what a server is, defining different types of servers, the little server and the server. We've talked about the server operating systems and the hardware. Now let's go into talking about the different types of servers. What do you use servers for? So now that we've gone over the basics of what servers are, let's start talking about what servers actually do for you. What do they do for the network? The first thing that you have to realize when we start talking about all these possible functions of servers, whether it's file server, FTP server, web server, database server, terminal services server, mail server, etc., is these are simply server pieces of software, just like Word or Excel or PowerPoint on your computer. So one server, one physical computer with one server operating system can provide multiple server functions. So don't think that one computer can only do one thing. It's like your desktop computer. You know, your desktop computer can have Photoshop and Word and Firefox and all these other things. A server can be a mail server and an FTP server and an Active Directory server all at one time. In this next little bit, I'm going to break down all these separate server services into their own parts and talk about what these individual components can do. But I don't want you to think that you have to have a physical computer for each one of these components. They can all be on one computer. Windows, when you buy a Windows 2008 server, most of this functionality is already built into it. So these pieces of software are already built into and included in the operating system that you get. So when you get a Windows 2008 server, not only do you get the server operating system, but the file server is already built in. The web server, so if you wanted to have a website, IIS, it's called Internet Information Server, is already built in. FTP server is already built in. Terminal Services Server is already built in. Active Directory Server is already built in. So if you get a Windows 2008 server, most of the server functionality that you will ever use is already built in to that server. If you are using Linux, you have to install all of these different pieces of server software individually. So when you create your Ubuntu server, when you start it up for the first time, it's not going to do a lot. You have to install and set up the FTP server. You have to set up the Apache web server. You have to set up the database server. That stuff is not already included in the software. And again, if you don't need a server that's going to deal with 1,000 or 10,000 people, you're just going to use a little Windows XP computer. There is software that you can buy to install in that little Windows XP computer so that it can have a lot of the server functionality. So if you want a fully functional web server on a Windows XP home computer, you can download for free something called Apache Web Server. And this makes that little Windows XP desktop computer a full web server where you can run a real website off of it. Or you can install MySQL database, so it can be a database server. You can install something called FileZilla server, so it becomes a full-fledged FTP file server. So what I want you to realize as we go into all these different things that servers can do is that all these functions can be on one box, so you can have one physical server that does all of these things. If you buy a Windows 2008 server operating system, most of this functionality is already built into it. Basically, you just have to turn it on. If you're using Linux, you're probably going to have to install all of the functionality that you want it to do. And if you're using one of the desktop operating systems, Windows XP, Windows 7, Windows Vista, a lot of the functionality, you can get a lot of the functionality by installing additional pieces of software onto it. Like I say, FileZilla FTP server, if you wanted to use it as an FTP server, or Apache to turn a Windows Vista computer into a full-fledged web server. So all the things we're going to talk about is basically software. Think of it as like Word and Excel and PowerPoint, but the server variety. So with that, let's go in and talk about the different things that servers can do. Now, one of the functions that most people are most familiar with are the security functions that a server can provide for your network. If you've ever gone to a university, if you've ever worked in a major corporation, when you sit down at your computer, you have to log into the computer. And not only do you log into the computer, but you actually log into the network. So there is a server on the network that allows you access to the network. And this is something called an authentication server. Now, in the Windows world, they use something called Active Directory. So you have an Active Directory server. Basically, when you sit down to log in to the network, your username, your password goes up to that Active Directory server. That Active Directory server makes sure everything is okay, and then it gives you something called an access control key digitally. This access control key says what permissions you have to do things on the network. So basically you log in, it gives you this key, and then you can then get into the files and folders that you're supposed to gain access to, and you're not allowed to get into the files and folders you're not allowed access to. So in Windows, this is called Active Directory, and this is provided by something called domain controllers. Back in the day, back with Windows NT, there used to be something called primary domain controllers and backup domain controllers. Nowadays, there are just domain controllers. There's something called replication. We'll talk about it in a different class. You go to any one of these domain controller servers, you give it the username and password, and then it gives you an access control key to allow you to get to whatever resources you're allowed to use on the network. If you're using Linux, they have something called a Samba server, S-A-M-B-A. It works much like the old Windows NT primary domain controllers. So it's not as robust and it's not as fully functional as the new Windows 2008 Active Directory servers, but it does allow you to have one single place where people can log into on the network and get access to different resources. Active Directory was created by Novell originally, and Novell NetWare also has an option for this type of server. So the first type of server that you're probably used to dealing with is the authentication server. All this server does is allows you to send your credentials, your username and password go to it, and then it sends a key back to your computer to allow you to get to accesses and resources on the network. That's all it does. So we've talked about the authentication. The next type of server that you're probably most familiar with is something called a print server. So back in the day, back 15 years ago, what you used to do is you used to have a computer on the network. You would plug a printer into that computer, and then you would share the printer to the rest of the network. So you could have one printer connected to a computer, and then 100 people could then, through that computer, print out. So that was a print server. Like I said, back in the day, they had very, very specialized servers that's all they did. So all a print server does is allows you to share a local printer on the network. Well, that was kind of expensive. So the most common solution after that was HP came up with these what were called JetDirect print servers. So there were these little gray boxes. They kind of look like little switches that you might buy at Best Buy right now. And what you could do is it had one port for the network and one port for an HP printer. So this HP JetDirect print server would act like a normal print server and allow people to print to that printer. So you could have 100 people basically sharing one printer. As time went by, that print server, that HP JetDirect print server, became an HP JetDirect card. So it went from being a box to just being a card that you could slide in as an additional accessory to the newer HP printers that came out. As time progressed beyond that, then the print server got built in to the printer. So now printers have built-in print servers. So just keep this in mind when people are talking about print servers, is now in 2010, most of the time print servers, the actual print server is built in to the printer, and you just plug the network cable directly into that printer. It works on the same ideas as when you used to have a computer plugged into the printer. It's just all now into a single printer. So that's what a print server is it's simply a computer that allows other people to print through it. Nowadays, you may still, like if you have a small office or in your home, you may have a desktop computer that acts as a print server. So you may have a print server that way. But that's all a print server is. So past the authentication server and the print server, we then have the file server, which you're probably very, very used to. This is where you have a network share, so you have a folder that's shared on the network, and everybody in the office can just get into that share and open up or modify, do whatever they want to the files that are inside the share. That's all a file server is. It is simply a computer that has a share folder or shared folders with shared files that people on the network can access. There's just not a lot to it. That's all there is. So now we start coming to things that you may not think about, that you may not be used to thinking about with servers. The next thing is web and FTP servers. So this is a server that you go to and it presents you a website. So this is a server like everymanit.com is presented on. When you come to our server, it gives you a website. There are two main pieces of software available that are for websites. There's either Apache, APACHE, which is open source and free. It can be used on any operating system to allow that operating system to be a full-fledged web server. Or in the Windows world, there is something called IIS, Internet Information Server. There's a version built into all Windows operating systems. If you deal with Windows Server, so Windows Server 2008 operating systems, you have the full-fledged version of IIS and you can present a world-class website using that. If you have Windows 7 or Windows Vista or Windows XP, they have a version of IIS built into those too, but it's not as robust. They don't allow you as many connections. Don't quote me on it, but I think they only allow like 20 concurrent connections at a time. So only 20 people can be on your website at any one time. So the two types of web servers out there are Apache and IIS. Again, Apache can be installed on Windows, it can be installed on Macs, it can be installed on Linux, it can be installed on anything. IIS can only be installed on Windows computers. Now, along with the web server that provides you, websites, you also normally have something called an FTP server. This is something called File Transfer Protocol. File Transfer Protocol allows you to transfer files from one place to the other. So if you're trying to upload files onto your website, you would use FTP. This is different than a normal, like a file server. A file server uses a special protocol in order to transfer files back and forth. FTP, it uses a different protocol to transfer files back and forth. But normally, FTP servers are servers that normally sit on the internet and allow you to upload large files to them for whatever reason. And they're normally included with web servers. So after web servers and FTP servers, we now have mail servers. So these are servers specially designed, or software specially designed to route email. So what you do with an email server is you set it up in your office, and then all the email for your company, so if you have 100 people, all the email for your company will go into that one single server, and then that server will decide what to do with it. It'll send it out to wherever it needs to go. Most people are used to Microsoft Exchange servers. So with Microsoft Exchange servers, all the email comes into the Exchange server, and then whenever anybody logs in using Outlook, they're able to get all of their email off of that server. Or if they have smartphones or iPhones or such, that Exchange server can also send emails to whoever it needs to go to their smartphones. So the email server actually routes email for a company or for an organization. The most common email server, again, is Microsoft Exchange. In order to use Microsoft Exchange, you have to have a Windows server. It will only run on Windows. If you don't want to use Microsoft Exchange, there's a whole slew of other types of email software out there. Some of it's free, some of it's very expensive, some of it only runs on Linux, some of it only runs on Windows. It's all depends on what you decide to use and what you decide to buy. But the main thing is what mail servers do is they take all the email for an organization and then they route it to the right people. So the next type of server is a database server. So databases, all they do is store data. They store data and allow outside applications to put data into it, to pull data out, to manipulate the data that's there. But all databases do, all they're worried about is data. They don't have fancy interfaces. They don't look cool. They're just basically, they're like a lot of things. All you get is a little DOS prompt. and you have to type in these long SQL statements if you want to get anything out of it normally. But outside pieces of software can interact with a database server, and like I say, they can either put in data or pull out data. So if you have a customer contact database, you would use this. Let's say if you have a ticketing system, ticketing systems use databases. So it gathers all the information from a ticket and puts it into a single database. Most of the time, database servers reside in the same server as a web server. So let's say like this website, Everyman IT has a database as part of the website. So there is a MySQL server installed alongside the Apache server software that runs the website. But all databases do is database servers do is they just handle data. The most popular database software in the web world is something called MySQL, which is free and open source. There is also Microsoft SQL, which is not free. It's very expensive. It will only run on Microsoft SQL servers. And then, of course, you probably also know of Oracle, which again is horribly expensive and runs on all of its own stuff. But basically, all database servers do is they just deal with data. They don't really do anything fancy with it. They just store it and allow you to access it or put stuff into it. So the final type of server that we're going to talk about is a remote access server. So nowadays, these are normally VPN servers or virtual private networks. Back in the day, they used to have dial-up servers that would actually have little modem cards in them, and you could actually dial into the server. But nowadays, we're normally just dealing with VPN. So what the remote access server does is allows you to connect to the server and then from there get access to the rest of the network. So if you're out on the internet and you have a piece of VPN software and you have this remote access server, so it's a VPN server, you can connect through the internet to that server, and then once you've connected to that server, you get the resources that are in that local network. So imagine if you wanted to print to a printer that's in an office 500 miles away. You would connect to the server in that office using something called VPN, and then once you've connected to that server, it's as if you're on that local network, and so you could then print to that printer. But basically, all the remote access servers do is they allow you to connect to the internal network from the outside world from the internet, and then once you've done that, then it's like you're basically, as far as the network is concerned, you're local. You can use all the local resources. You can print to a local printer. You can get your email just like you're in the building. That's all a remote access server is. So we've discussed a lot of things in this Introduction to Servers class. It may take a while for it to all digest, so don't worry. Servers are a whole new world compared to simply dealing with desktop computers. All servers are, remember, all a server is, just a normal server, all a server is a computer that provides services to other computers. So if you have a printer plugged into the back of your computer and you have shared that printer out so somebody else on the network can print to it, then you have a print server. If you have a shared folder on your computer so other people can access that folder, then you have a file server. Although servers, that is what a server is, it just provides services. There is a difference between servers and servers. Servers, like I say, you can use a Windows XP Home Edition computer to be a basic server. You can have it be a web server, you can have it be a file server, you can have it be a print server, you can have it do most of the functions that the servers can do. But it's not as stable, it's not as robust, and there's much more chance that something will go hinky with it than with an enterprise server. So they're cheaper, but they're not as robust. Whereas servers, use server operating systems. So whether it's Windows 2008 Server Edition you're using, or whether it's Ubuntu Linux Server Edition, or Red Hat Enterprise Linux Server Edition, or Mac OS X Server Edition, that server software is built for servers, and therefore, of course, if you try to play video games on it, it's not going to be as good as that desktop computer, but it is very good for file sharing, for websites, for authentication servers, and the rest of that. Real servers are meant to deal with a lot of communication with the outside world. Again, an authentication server can deal with up to 10,000 clients. So for every 10,000 users you can have one of these Windows 2008 servers. Now there's the hardware that we've talked about. Again, you can use any hardware. You can go out and you can buy a $200 e-machine, or you can go out and you can buy a netbook and use it as a server if you want to. It doesn't matter, well, it doesn't matter. You don't have to use really high quality parts for a server. But if you're like me and you have your server in a data center and your life kind of depends on it, then there is specific hardware that you should have for your server. This includes a Xeon processor, so a processor designed for servers. This includes redundant power supplies. So if one power supply fails, one of those power module fails, the computer stays up and running, and you simply pull out the bad power supply and put the new one in. This includes RAID. This is where you have multiple hard drives with redundancy. So if one hard drive fails, you can pull the bad hard drive out and put a new hard drive in, and again, the computer doesn't go down. There's no problems. And again, there's something called ECC RAM. This is error checking RAM. It actually does tests on itself. Again, this is much better RAM, and it ensures you have less problems with your server. But in my book, it is so much more expensive that I'm not going to mess with it. I don't put it in my servers, but it's there. So the server hardware, depending on what you're doing, depends on what you want to buy. If you're sharing out some files with 5 people in the office, by all means buy that e-machine. If you have a server that's sitting in a data center somewhere that can never crash, then get real server hardware. We just talked about all the functionality that a lot of these servers can have. There's even more. There's so many things servers can do. But I gave you the basic rundown of the common things that most people use servers for. Again, all these different functions are simply pieces of software, just like you would install on a desktop computer. So, a desktop computer can do more than Word. It can do Word and Excel and PowerPoint and Photoshop and Firefox. So a server can do authentication and be a file server and be a web server and be a database server and be a remote access server, all in one box. So don't think you have to have one server for each of these individual things. As we talked about, Windows 2008 servers come with all of these components already built in, and you basically just have to turn them on and configure them. If you use Linux, you almost always have to install these different services separately. And again, a lot of the functionality that I talked about, you can install onto a Windows XP home computer, but you do have to download the software to allow that to happen. We talked about the authentication servers. All this is when you log into the network, it's what allows you access to the things you should have access to. That's all an authentication server does. We talked about the print servers. This allows one printer to be shared by multiple people on the network. And we talked about back in the day, it was a big computer, it was a big actual server, and then HP came out with these things called JetDirect devices, and then those became cards, and then that all just got built into the printer itself. So you may see that the printer has an internal print server, and that's what they're talking about. File servers, again, this is just shared files on the network. Web server, so you either use something called Apache or IIS to provide websites to people that go to your server. Just like this website here. Almost always, if you have a web server, you also have an FTP server. This is a way to transfer files back and forth over the internet. It does so in a different way than a normal file server does. So they kind of do the same thing, but in a different way. So an FTP server is different than a file server. That's very important to remember. We talked about mail servers. These are simply servers that route mail for an organization. So all the email for an organization comes into one server, and then that server decides what to do with it. So many times the server will have spam filters built in, or it'll have like a BlackBerry enterprise server built in, so it'll filter out the spam, and then it will send emails to the appropriate BlackBerry devices or smartphone devices. Again, the most popular mail server out there is something called Exchange, Microsoft Exchange server. This is a Microsoft product, and of course can only be installed onto Microsoft servers. Can't be installed on anything else. There are a lot of other mail servers out there on the market. Some can only be used on Windows, some can only be used on Linux, some are free, some are very expensive. So if you don't want to use Exchange, you just got to go out there and do some research. Talk about database servers. Database servers, all they do is they just store data, and they store it very, very, very well. This is used for things like contact database systems, ticket management systems, etc. And then finally, we talked about the remote access servers. These are the servers that allow people from the outside world to connect to them and then use resources on the internal network. So basically, you're sitting in Bangkok, you need to use something that's local in an office in New York. You use VPN, Virtual Private Network, to connect to that New York office, and then you're able to access resources on that local network as if you're sitting there, just on a little slower connection. And that's really that's the introduction to servers. This is going to be a long this is going to be a long track that's going to take me quite a while to fill out. So don't feel bad if this seems a little confusing right at the moment. I just wanted to give you this brief introduction just so you can start getting your head around what servers are, because like I say, most people learn about servers from vendor-specific classes. Like I said, when I first learned about servers, I only learned about Microsoft servers. I had friends, all they learned about was Novell. I had other people, all they learned about was Linux. And so when you're so specific on the products, you don't really get such a good idea on the larger world and how everything else works and what options that you or your clients have. The real world advice that I will give to you, that I've seen happen far too often, is if you have a special piece of software, or your client has a special piece of software, and you're told that it needs to run on a server, make sure you find out what the people mean by server. I have seen a lot of people, when I had the repair shop, that they would go out and they would buy these $4,000 and $5,000 servers because they were told they needed a server in order to run some piece of software. These servers were very expensive. They're more expensive to maintain because you do need to be certified. You do need more knowledge to maintain them than you do to maintain a desktop computer, etc. And then when I would call whoever created the program and just trying to figure out what's going on and say, yeah, it says it needs a server, now why does it need a Windows 2008 server? They said, oh, no, it just needs a dedicated computer. So you can just have a Windows XP professional computer as the server. It doesn't have to be a Windows 2008 server. So that's something that happens in the real world, and I've seen it happen way too often, where people think they need one of these very, very, very powerful servers for a 5-person office because, again, they buy some piece of software and they were told they need a server to run it. Well, remember, the definition of a server is simply a computer that provides services to clients. So before you or your client run out and spend $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 on a very robust enterprise class server, make sure that little e-machine won't do just fine. Keep that in mind. Really, things will be a lot better for you. So as always, I hope you've kept up with me. This will be a long and interesting track, and we have a lot of information to go over. But it's good. Servers make the world go around. But again, this class was Introduction to Servers. I am Eli, the Computer Guy, and I look forward to seeing you at the next class.